My mother called me a freeloader at our family dinner, and my father did not correct her. He just nodded the way men do when they believe a judgment has already been made. The word landed quietly without anger or drama, which somehow made it worse. The fork in her hand tapped once against the plate, a soft sound that told me the conversation was already over. The television in the living room muttered about a basketball game no one cared about, and the smell of overcooked chicken hung in the air, dry and sharp. I sat there and nodded too, because nodding had become my reflex. My name is Arden. I am 28 years old. I work from home, and to my parents, that combination meant I had failed some invisible test they never bothered to explain. My father, Frank, sat at the head of the table, posture, straight voice, steady, a man who measured worth in service ribbons and discipline. My mother, Diane, smiled the way she always did when she said something cruel politely, as if manners could soften the damage. My sister, Tessa, sat across from me, legs crossed, just right. The golden child who had mastered the art of looking successful, even when she was waiting for someone else to confirm it. This dinner mattered, they kept reminding me. Tonight was about family pride. Tonight was about the Navy. At some point, Arden, my mother, said a grown woman needs a real job. My father followed without hesitation. Your sister married a man who actually serves. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I watched grease collect at the edge of my plate and wondered when the people who raised me had become so comfortable discussing my value like an expense they were tired of carrying. Inside my head I thought, I do not know what a real job looks like to you, but I know exactly who in this room lives off someone else's reputation. I kept that thought where it belonged. Silence had always been safer. I had come back to Norfolk for what they called a family dinner, a phrase that usually meant judgment wrapped in concern. Frank and Diane lived only a few miles from the base, close enough that jets sometimes rattled the windows in the afternoon. Tessa lived for nights like this, nights where she could talk about her husband's career and watch our parents glow with borrowed pride. Her husband, Commander Keller, a decorated naval officer, was late. He was always late when it mattered, and somehow that only made his arrival feel more important. As the minutes passed, the comments sharpened. At least your sister brings something to the table, my mother said with a soft laugh, and something tight and familiar settled in my chest. The irony almost made me smile. I was the one who had paid for the groceries that night, the one who had covered the last repair on their dishwasher without mentioning it. But I knew better than to point that out. There are moments when defending yourself only confirms what they already believe. Over the years, I had learned something that had nothing to do with winning arguments. You do not beat a toxic family by talking louder. You beat them by letting them hear the truth from the one voice they trust more than their own. I just did not expect that voice to walk through the front door in less than an hour. When headlights swept across the driveway and light spilled briefly across the wall, I looked up from my plate and felt the room shift. By the end of that meal, the word freeloader would die right there at that table, and everyone in the room would know it. If your own family ever called you a burden in front of everyone, would you stay quiet to keep the peace, or would you stand up and walk away? Before this story continues, please allow me to clarify something important. The story you are about to hear is a work of fiction created for educational and entertainment purposes. It explores themes of toxic family dynamics and their emotional impact within the context of military life and military families in the United States. All characters, ranks, units, events, and situations are entirely fictional and do not represent, reflect, or imply any real individuals, military units, or organizations associated with the United States Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, or Coast Guard. This content may be supported by AI tools during the creative and production process. The story is not intended to depict real events, disclose military information, or encourage violence, hatred, or harm in any form. The message is presented with respect for the core values of the United States military, including honor, discipline, responsibility, and human dignity. All content is designed to be advertiser-friendly, compliant with YouTube community guidelines, and not intended to misrepresent or damage the image of the U.S. military or its service members. If you are a woman who has stood quietly behind a military family, who has endured more than others could see, please stay until the end. And if this story resonates with you, consider sharing your thoughts in the comments or following the channel to continue with stories for strong hearts that are rarely heard. If you had asked my parents when the idea first took root that something was wrong with me, they would probably say it started when I was a teenager. Not because I caused trouble or talked back or broke rules. It was quieter than that. I was 16 the first time my mother described me as difficult, a word she delivered with a smile, as if it were a compliment she wished she did not have to give. I did not like to pose for photos. I did not like standing in front of banners or flags or forced smiles. I did not brag about what I was doing or what I wanted to do. I listened more than I spoke, and that alone seemed to make adults nervous. My sister Tessa never had that problem. Tessa learned early that success was something you performed. She smiled on command. She stood where she was told. She let our parents post photos of her in dresses she did not pick, holding certificates she barely remembered earning. When she started dating men in uniform, my parents finally relaxed. They had found their proof. Diane would say things like, "Look how confident she is," or "She just knows how to present herself," and then glance at me with that polite pause that always carried an unspoken comparison. Frank never hid his standard. To him, masculinity and worth were measured by service, by the willingness to wear something recognizable and follow a visible chain of command. If you did not fit that image, you were drifting. If you were drifting, you were wasting potential. By the time I was 18, the label had settled in place. Hard to read. Too quiet, not ambitious enough. At family gatherings, Diane would praise Tessa for her discipline, and then turn to me and say, "Arden has always marched to her own beat," which was her way of saying I did not march at all. Frank would shake his head and add, "Some people just do not have that drive," as if drive were something you could only prove by wearing a uniform. I learned quickly that explaining myself only made things worse, so I stopped. I went to school. I paid my own way. I took jobs that did not photograph well. Meanwhile, Tessa's life unfolded exactly the way our parents had hoped. Engagement photos, military balls, stories about ceremonies and promotions that Frank repeated to anyone who would listen. Diane framed invitations like they were awards. When Tessa married Keller, the house filled with words like honor and commitment and legacy. I was congratulated politely as if I were a guest rather than a daughter. By the time I moved out and started working from home, the verdict was already written. To my parents, work was only real if it required leaving the house and being seen doing it. Anything else was a phase you were expected to outgrow. At dinner that night in March, all of that history sat between us, invisible but heavy. When Diane called me a freeloader, it did not feel like a new insult. It felt like the final summary of years of quiet judgment. Frank did not challenge her because in his mind the case had already been closed. Tessa did not look uncomfortable because she had grown up benefiting from the comparison. The comments that followed came easily. "At least your sister brings something to the table," Diane said lightly, as if she were offering perspective rather than delivering a sentence. Frank nodded along, satisfied, because in his world, bringing something to the table meant medals, stories, visible proof. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the urge to correct the record, and then the equally familiar decision to stay quiet. The strange part was the timing. They said it while sitting at a table I had paid for, eating food I had bought in a house whose last repair bill had my name on it. That was the joke of it, the part I almost laughed at. They talked about contribution, as if it were something you announced, not something you did. I did not point that out. I simply noted it the way you note a fact that explains everything else. In that moment, I understood that to them, value was never about support or responsibility. It was about optics, and in a family like mine, optics always beat reality. I live alone in a small apartment not far from the water, the kind of place people describe as temporary, even when they have lived there for years. It is clean and spare and intentionally unremarkable. No framed quotes, no trophies, no expensive furniture, a couch that fits the room, a table that doubles as a desk, a kettle that whistles too loudly in the morning. When my parents picture me working from home, I know what they see: pajamas, distraction, time slipping away. What they never picture is the discipline it takes to keep your own structure when no one is watching. My workday starts early before traffic thickens and before the base fully wakes up. I like the quiet because it is honest. I open my laptop and read through updates that never make the news. Schedule adjustments, training delays, readiness windows shifting by hours or days. I do not give orders. I do not raise my voice. I coordinate. I make sure the system holds when a person is absent, when a position is in transition, when the machine has to keep running even if one part disappears. The simplest way I have ever explained it to myself is this: I make sure the engine does not stall when the driver steps away. That explanation has never impressed anyone at my family table. There are days when I know things before the city does. A planned power interruption near the base that will reroute traffic by noon. A temporary access change that will turn an ordinary street into a slow crawl for the afternoon. I hear about it, quietly confirm it twice, and then move on. By the time the local radio mentions it, I am already on to the next item. Once, while I was still sitting at my parents' table earlier that evening, I knew the next morning traffic would be a mess near their neighborhood. The thought crossed my mind to warn them to save Frank the frustration of sitting in his car, muttering about poor planning. I did not. Experience had taught me that unsolicited information sounds like arrogance to people who already believe you have nothing to offer. In the middle of my workday, my phone sometimes rings with a number that is not saved. I answer, listen, and respond with only what is required. Yes, understood. I will confirm. Then I hang up and return to what I was doing. No one applauds that kind of work. No one posts photos of it. There are no ceremonies attached to keeping things steady. That invisibility suits me. I have never needed my work to look impressive. I need it to be correct. When I visit my parents, Diane likes to ask what I am doing now, as if the answer might change if she asks often enough. I usually say the same thing: I work from home. Frank hears that and translates it into absence. To him, if you are not leaving the house in a uniform, you are pretending. Sometimes in my head I laugh at how close he is to the truth without realizing it. With my family, if you are not wearing something recognizable, they assume you are playing at adulthood. They think you are cosplaying responsibility. I let them think that because explaining protocol to people who only respect appearances is exhausting. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you do and why it matters, even when no one around you believes it does. That confidence does not look like pride. It looks like patience. It looks like listening while someone underestimates you and choosing not to interrupt. You do not need anyone to believe in your work for it to have value, but you do need to understand it yourself clearly enough that doubt from others does not shake you. That night at dinner, as the comments continued and the labels settled into place, I reminded myself of that truth. I knew what my work affected. I knew how far its reach extended. I also knew that none of that needed to be explained yet. Some systems only reveal their importance when they are tested. Until then, they are invisible by design. Before the night was over, that invisibility was about to end. You think a real job is something that looks impressive from the outside, or is it something that lets other people sleep at night? The shift from being dismissed to being managed happened quietly, the way it always does in families that believe control is the same thing as care. My mother pulled me aside before Keller arrived, her hand resting lightly on my arm, as if we were sharing something tender instead of transactional. Tonight, she said, keep it simple. Do not say anything strange. Do not make my son-in-law uncomfortable. And please do not bring up that work-from-home thing again. It sounds bad. Each sentence was delivered with the same practiced calm, the tone she used when correcting a waiter or negotiating a return. I nodded because nodding had become second nature, but inside I cataloged each instruction the way I had learned to catalog other directives in other environments. Frank joined us in the hallway, arms crossed, jaw set, in that familiar expression that meant he was about to define a line and dare someone to step over it. This dinner matters, he said. This is not about you. If you embarrass this family tonight, do not bother coming back here. The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. They carried the weight of consequence, the kind meant to remind you that belonging is conditional. I stood there and listened as my parents laid out the terms of my presence. Be quiet, be agreeable, be invisible. They called it keeping the peace. In my head, I called it an order. It struck me then how easily the language of authority slips into domestic life. The structure was familiar: a clear objective, a list of prohibitions, an implied penalty. I had seen this pattern before, just not usually wrapped in family concern. Diane returned to the kitchen as if the matter were settled, already smiling again, already rehearsing the story she would tell about how well the evening went. Frank lingered a moment longer, watching me as if gauging whether the warning had landed. I gave him nothing. I had learned that showing emotion in moments like that only fed the narrative he preferred. Back at the table, the air felt tighter. Every comment was weighed, every glance carried an expectation. Tessa noticed the shift and seemed relieved by it. She thrived when roles were clearly defined: golden child, proud parents, silent problem child. The structure made sense to her. As I sat there, I thought about how often control is justified by the promise of harmony. Family peace, they called it. A phrase that sounded generous until you realized who was always being asked to sacrifice for it. I watched my mother move between the stove and the table, orchestrating plates and conversation with surgical precision. I watched my father straighten his chair and glance at the clock, anticipating Keller's arrival like a moment of validation. I listened to my sister talk about upcoming events, careful not to mention anything that might invite questions about my life. The unspoken rule was clear. I was allowed to be present as long as I did not take up space. I felt the familiar mix of anger and resignation, the urge to either leave or comply. I chose neither. I stayed. I stayed because something about the formal nature of the warning had triggered a different kind of awareness. I had seen this kind of order issued before in rooms where people believed authority flowed in only one direction. I had watched those orders hold until someone with actual standing entered the space and changed the dynamic without raising their voice. The thing about commands is that they depend entirely on who has the right to give them. As Frank leaned back in his chair and Diane resumed her commentary on appearances and impressions, I thought about that distinction. I thought about how often power is mistaken for volume or visibility. I thought about how temporary silence can be. They believed they had contained the problem by containing me. They believed compliance would preserve their image. What they did not consider was that orders like this have a lifespan. They function only until the moment someone with recognized authority steps into the room and renders them irrelevant. I did not smile at the thought, but I felt steadier because of it. I had been on the receiving end of directives before. I knew the sound of them. I also knew they rarely survive contact with the right presence. As the sound of a car pulling into the driveway reached the dining room, I sat back in my chair and waited, fully aware that the silence they had imposed was about to be tested. Dinner settled into its familiar rhythm once the plates were served, a rhythm built from small talk and repetition, the kind that lets people feel productive without saying anything meaningful. The television kept talking from the living room, commentators arguing about rankings while no one listened, and the clink of silverware filled the gaps between sentences. Diane asked Frank whether the HOA had raised the monthly fee again, and Frank launched into a complaint about gas prices and how people did not appreciate planning anymore. Tessa nodded at the right moments, adding comments about neighborhood upkeep and curb appeal, the words flowing easily because they never required her to take a position. I chewed slowly and kept my eyes on my plate, aware of how often silence invites commentary. Frank leaned back and began one of his favorite stories, the one about how Keller had been praised by a superior during a recent event, how a few words spoken in the right room could echo for weeks. Diane jumped in, smoothly reminding us that Keller was decorated. That recognition mattered, that it said something about the kind of man he was and the kind of family they were. The word decorated was repeated with care, polished with pride each time it was said. I noticed how Tessa's posture changed when they talked about him, how she sat a little taller, how she smiled without looking at anyone in particular. Diane set her fork down and glanced at me, her smile gentle, her timing precise. Arden will probably understand commitment better once she learns to support herself, she said, as if offering advice rather than judgment. The sentence hovered there perfectly, placed its meaning unmistakable. Tessa let out a soft laugh and tilted her head in my direction. "It is okay," she said. "Arden is still figuring herself out." The words landed cleanly, sharpened by familiarity. I felt the familiar sting and swallowed it the way you swallow something bitter when you know reacting will only make it worse. My father did not intervene. He rarely did. To him, the lesson was being taught correctly. The comments kept coming, framed as concern disguised as encouragement. Diane talked about how independence builds character. Frank nodded and added that nothing teaches discipline like responsibility. Each remark was small enough to deny if challenged, sharp enough to cut if absorbed. I focused on details instead, the way the gravy had cooled too quickly, the faint squeak of a chair leg as Frank shifted his weight, the steady hum of the refrigerator behind me. At one point, I looked at my mother's hands as she reached for her glass, the slight tremor she tried to hide, the familiar ring catching the light. That was when it clicked for me. Toxic does not always shout. It often whispers. It uses softness as camouflage. It smiles while it tightens the rope. Understanding that did not make the words hurt less, but it did make them clearer. This was not about money or work or contribution. It was about maintaining a hierarchy that made sense to them. I let the moment pass without comment, feeling the ache rise, and then settle, replaced by a steadier resolve. There is a point where pain turns into observation, where you stop taking notes emotionally and start taking notes practically. I had reached that point years ago. As Diane cleared plates and Frank resumed his commentary on planning and foresight, I glanced toward the front of the house. The light from outside shifted as something moved past the window. A sound followed tires on gravel, a car easing into the driveway. I recognized the timing instantly. The air in the room changed, subtle but real, like pressure before a storm. I heard the engine cut off and the door close, the rhythm of steps approaching the house. I knew then that the dinner was about to change its direction, that the careful balance they had enforced was about to be tested by something they did not control. I stayed seated. I did not reach for my coat or my bag. I watched the doorway and waited, fully aware of the choice in front of me. If you were in my place, would you stand up and walk away at that moment? Or would you stay and see how far they were willing to go? The front door opened without ceremony, no dramatic pause, no announcement, just the simple sound of a latch turning and a door swinging inward. Commander Keller stepped inside as if he had walked through 100 doors like this. In a day, steady, contained, carrying the quiet presence of someone who stays on duty, even when he is off the clock. He did not bring the room with him. He did not demand attention. He simply entered and the room adjusted around him. He wore a plain jacket over a crisp shirt, nothing flashy, nothing performative. His cap was in his hand, not displayed, not waved, just held with the kind of casual care that told you it mattered to him even when he did not need it to. The smell of cooler air followed him in for a second, and then the house returned to its warm, overcooked stillness. Diane brightened instantly, her smile widening into something practiced. "There you are," she said, relief and pride blending together. Frank stood halfway from his chair chest, lifting, ready to receive the evening he thought he owned. Keller moved toward them with polite efficiency, the way he might approach a senior neighbor or a family elder, not exaggerated, not stiff, just correct. He shook Frank's hand, first firm and brief, then turned to Diane and greeted her with the same clean respect, a slight nod, a quiet good evening. Tessa rose next, smoothing her shirt, eyes shining with the kind of anticipation that comes from being seen next to someone important. Keller acknowledged her with a quick touch at her shoulder, not affectionate in a public way, more like a signal of presence. Then he angled his body toward the dining room. The table was set with white plates and mismatched glasses, the kind of setup that tries to look formal by trying too hard. The television still murmured from the next room, unaware it was about to be ignored completely. Keller's eyes swept the table in a single practiced movement, not searching for food or conversation, but scanning the way people scan when they enter a space and need to understand it immediately. His gaze touched Diane, Frank, Tessa, the plates, the empty chair at the side, and then it landed on me. It was not dramatic. It was not a stare. It was a look of recognition so small that anyone without experience would miss it. His eyes held mine for a fraction longer than politeness required, and in that fraction something shifted in his face before it smoothed back into neutral. The room went quiet without anyone choosing it. Forks paused. Conversation stalled. Diane's smile froze in place, still pleasant, but suddenly too still, like a mask held 1 second too long. Frank remained half standing, the confidence in his posture faltering, as if someone had cut a wire inside him. Tessa blinked once, then looked at me as if trying to confirm what she was seeing. Keller did not speak right away. He straightened slightly, shoulders, setting chin lifting by a degree, the kind of posture change that is almost invisible unless you have spent time around people trained to carry themselves with intention. Then he took 1 step closer to my side of the table and stopped. He did not glance at Frank for permission. He did not look to Diane for approval. He looked only at me. The next movement was clean and simple. His hand rose in a salute, brief and exact, not theatrical, not performed for an audience, just executed the way a truth is executed when it cannot be softened. He held it for a beat, not long enough to draw attention, long enough to make the point, then lowered his hand with the same control. "Mom," he said, voice steady, respectful, quiet enough that it was meant for me, loud enough that the table could not pretend it did not hear. The word landed heavier than any insult that had been thrown at me all night. It was not flattery. It was not kindness. It was recognition, and recognition in my parents' house had always been reserved for other people. Diane's face did not change, but something behind her eyes did, a short blankness, a delay in processing, as if her brain had reached for a script and found the page missing. Frank stood fully now, but not in pride and confusion, his mouth slightly open as if he had been interrupted mid-belief. His hands hovered at his sides, uncertain, and for the first time in my memory, he looked small at his own table. Tessa's color drained fast, not into panic, but into a tight, controlled shock, the kind that happens when a hierarchy flips without warning. She looked from Keller to me and back again, trying to measure the distance between what she thought she knew and what was happening in front of her. The silence stretched, and in that stretch every remark from earlier seemed to echo back through the room. Freeloader, real job commitment, bringing something to the table. None of it fit anymore. I did not stand up quickly. I did not smile. I did not bask in the moment. I simply met Keller's eyes and felt something inside me settle, not triumph, not revenge, just a quiet confirmation that I had not imagined my own reality. I heard the television in the next room continue its meaningless commentary and thought, almost with surprise, that the loudest truth in the house had been delivered without raising a voice. In that moment, I understood why protocol exists. It is not there to humiliate, it is there to clarify. And nothing clarifies faster than respect shown in the one language a room like this cannot ignore. I sat with my hands folded near my plate, feeling the old ache still present but no longer owning me, and I thought, finally someone is telling the truth with action. The room stayed frozen for another heartbeat after Keller lowered his hand, as if no one wanted to be the first to make sound and risk confirming what had just happened. Diane's smile attempted to restart itself, but it came back thinner, like a light, flickering after a power dip. Frank cleared his throat once a small noise meant to restore his position, but it did not land. Tessa sat back down too quickly, eyes fixed on her plate, as if the ceramic might explain the sudden change in the room. Keller did not linger in the center of attention. He did not announce anything. He turned slightly as if to move on and let the evening continue, but his gaze returned to me for a brief moment, quiet and deliberate. Then he nodded toward the back of the house, subtle enough that only I would catch it. I stood not rushed, not apologetic, and followed him down the short hallway and out through the sliding door toward the small porch that faced the garage. The air outside was cooler and smelled faintly of salt from the nearby water mixed with the sharp scent of cut grass from a neighbor's yard. The porch light cast a soft circle on the wooden boards, and beyond it the driveway sat empty and still, the night calm in a way the dining room no longer was. Keller stopped near the edge of the porch, keeping his voice low, not secretive for drama, but respectful of the fact that some things are not meant to be performed. "I did not know it was you," he said. The sentence came out with no excuses attached, just a blunt admission. He exhaled once and added, "I should have checked the continuity roster." Hearing the words out loud felt strange, like hearing a private system name spoken in a place filled with family photos and casual cruelty. I did not offer an explanation. I did not fill the silence for him. I looked at him and asked the only question that mattered, the one that held every insult from the table inside it. "You did not check before you let them call me that." My voice was steady, not loud, not angry, just flat enough to make the truth unavoidable. Keller's jaw tightened slightly, and for the first time since he entered the house, I saw something human break through his professional composure. He did not defend himself. He nodded once as if accepting a correction he had earned. "I did not hear it tonight until I walked in," he said. "And when I recognized you, I could not let it stand." There was no pride in his voice, only a kind of restraint that sounded like discipline. For a moment we stood there, listening to the faint sound of the television inside still talking to itself, and the muffled movement of chairs as my family tried to recover. Then Keller spoke again carefully. "You know what they think of you," he said. "They have no idea what you actually do." I kept my eyes on him and said nothing. He continued choosing his words the way people do when they understand a line exists and do not want to cross it. The signature, he said quietly, the continuity confirmation on certain key billets, the readiness approvals that keep the machine stable when personnel shift, that is yours. He did not name a unit. He did not name a mission. He did not need to. The meaning was clear. My work was not about looking important. It was about preventing gaps that become problems when the wrong moment arrives. Keller glanced toward the house, then back to me. "A decision you made earlier this year affected my track," he said. "Not as punishment. It was protocol. It was the correct process, and I respected it." The words were not flattery. They were acknowledgement from someone trained to recognize authority even when it comes without a uniform. I felt the impulse to shrink, not because I was ashamed, but because I had spent so long being treated as if my life did not qualify as real. Standing there on a porch beside my sister's decorated husband, I did not suddenly feel powerful. I felt tired. I felt the weight of how easy it would have been for my family to know me if they had ever been curious instead of judgmental. Keller watched my face as if he understood that the hardest part was not the insults, but the years of being unseen. "I do not say this lightly," he added. "In my world, people stand up straight for less than what you carry." I did not respond with a speech. I did not list accomplishments. I had learned that explaining yourself to people who do not want the truth is just another form of begging. Instead, I held the line with one simple reality. "The greatest authority does not need to speak loudly," I said. "It only needs the right signature in the right place." Keller's eyes flickered with recognition, and he gave a small nod as if hearing a principle he had lived by. For a moment, the night felt still enough to think clearly. Inside the house, my parents were likely rearranging their faces, searching for a story that would protect their pride. Tessa was likely trying to decide whether to be offended or afraid. Keller looked at me again, and there was something unfinished in his expression, a warning held back. "They are reviewing," he began, then stopped, as if the next words belonged to a space more formal than a porch. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. I understood anyway. Whatever my family believed about real jobs and freeloaders was about to collide with reality in a way they could not smile through. When we walked back inside the dining room, felt like a stage after the lights have changed, and everyone forgot their lines. The plates were still on the table, the chicken still cooling the television, still talking from the next room, but the energy had shifted into something brittle. Diane was the first to attempt repair. She straightened her shoulders, widened her smile, and let out a small laugh that was meant to dissolve the tension. "Oh," she said, "he is just being polite." The words came out too quickly, like a reflex, as if she could rename what had happened and make it smaller. Frank nodded once in agreement, grateful for any explanation that allowed him to keep his place at the head of the table. Tessa did not speak. Her eyes kept dropping to Keller's hand, then to my face, then back to him, like she was trying to measure a distance she had never noticed before. Keller did not accept Diane's rewrite. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. He simply stepped into the room and stood where everyone could see him, posture, steady expression, calm, the kind of calm that does not ask for permission. He looked at Diane, then Frank, then Tessa, and finally at me, not as if seeking approval, but as if acknowledging that the truth had already been established. "Arden is not a freeloader," he said. The sentence landed cleanly with no softness around it. Diane's smile froze again, caught between offense and shock. Keller continued, voice level, still polite, still controlled. "And that is not a word you should use again." The silence that followed was immediate. Even the clink of silverware seemed to stop. Frank's face tightened, and I saw the familiar rise of his temper, the instinct to reclaim authority by making the room remember whose house it was. He started to speak, the beginning of a growl building in his throat. "In my house," he began, the phrase he had used for years, like a stamp. Keller did not interrupt rudely. He cut the line with respect, which somehow made it sharper. "With respect, sir," he said, and Frank stopped mid-sentence, as if a switch had been flipped. The words "with respect" did not soothe Frank. They cornered him. They forced him into a posture he could not escape without looking exactly like what he pretended not to be. Diane's hands moved toward her glass, then hesitated. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the ring on her left hand, a small gesture of self-control, and I watched her face work to find a new angle, a new script, a new way to turn this back into something she could manage. Tessa finally looked up, her eyes wide with a quiet calculation. She understood something then, not fully, not in detail, but enough to scare her. Whatever my work from home meant, whatever continuity roster meant, it was not a joke. It was not a hobby. It was something that touched Keller's world in a way she could not ignore. I could see it in the way her mouth tightened, in the way she stopped trying to look gracious and started trying to look careful. Frank stared at Keller as if deciding whether to challenge him, and then his gaze flicked to me, sharp and confused, like he was seeing me for the first time, and did not like the picture. Diane tried again, softer this time. "We did not mean anything by it," she said, the classic retreat into innocence. "We were just worried about Arden." Keller's expression did not change. "Worry does not sound like that," he said quietly. The sentence was not a lecture. It was a boundary. The air in the room felt thinner, as if everyone had to breathe more carefully. In that moment, I realized the justice of it was not in humiliation. It was in clarity. For years, my parents had treated my life as negotiable because they believed they controlled the narrative. They believed they could label me, and the label would become truth simply because they repeated it often enough. Keller did not argue. He did not expose details. He simply refused to accept their label, and the refusal alone collapsed the story they had built. It was not revenge in the childish sense. It was consequence. A system they respected had just contradicted them, and they could not talk their way out of it. I did not announce what I was. I did not name my role. I did not point to any invisible authority. I just looked at my mother, held her gaze, and spoke one sentence that carried everything I had been swallowing for years. "I heard you clearly," I said. My voice did not shake. It did not rise. It was not an accusation. It was a record. Diane blinked once, as if the simplicity of it hit harder than any argument would have. Frank's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Tessa stared at her plate like it was safer than looking at me. Keller remained standing, calm and unmovable, not performing, not seeking applause, simply holding the line he believed should never have been crossed. The room did not recover. It could not. Once a narrative breaks, you cannot tape it back together without everyone hearing the rip. If the truth is only believed when a person with status says it out loud, do you still call that family? Late March 2024 arrived with the kind of quiet that usually follows a storm, not peaceful, just careful. The dinner was over. The words had been said, and the house in Norfolk had returned to its routines, but something underneath had shifted, and everyone could feel it. I went back to my apartment and my work without ceremony, letting the week pass the way it always did, with early mornings and small decisions that never announced themselves. 10 days later, my phone rang while I was making coffee, the steam fogging the kitchen window just enough to blur the view outside. It was my mother. Her voice sounded different immediately, softer, slower, wrapped in that familiar sweetness she used when she wanted something without appearing to ask. "Arden," she said, "I just wanted to check in. We have all been thinking about you." There was a pause measured intentional. Then she continued, careful not to name what had changed. "I was wondering if you could maybe speak to someone. Just say a word, nothing official." The request was vague on purpose, shaped to slide past resistance. I pictured her sitting at the same table, hands folded, smile, ready, rehearsing the tone that would make this feel like reconciliation instead of leverage. I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. "Speak to whom?" I asked. Diane exhaled lightly, relieved to be engaged. "You know," she said, "the people you work with. Just help smooth things over. Keller has been under so much pressure and Tessa is very worried. We are family." The word family was placed carefully like a seal meant to close the deal. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue about the past. I answered the request directly, the way I had learned to answer others like it. "I do not trade readiness decisions for apologies," I said. There was another pause, longer this time. Diane tried again, her voice tightening just enough to reveal frustration beneath the sweetness. "I am not asking for special treatment," she said. "Just a little understanding. Rules are flexible when people care." That was when I ended the conversation, not by hanging up but by making the boundary unmistakable. "I do not rewrite rules to protect pride," I said. The line went quiet. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its softness. "So that is it," she said. "You are choosing work over family." I chose not to respond. Some accusations only exist to provoke defense, and I had learned not to feed them. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from my father. "Family is family," it read. A sentence he had used for years whenever he wanted loyalty without accountability. I did not reply. The consequences of my refusal unfolded the way real consequences do, slowly and without drama. Keller handled what needed to be handled through the proper channels, the same channels that exist precisely to prevent personal influence from distorting decisions. There were meetings he attended without my name ever being mentioned. There were reviews that followed procedure instead of shortcuts. Nothing was overturned. Nothing was adjusted quietly. Tessa called once, her voice tight, trying to sound casual and failing. She asked questions without finishing them, testing the idea that I might step in out of habit. I listened and said very little. It became clear to her then that the rules applied to her life as much as anyone else's. For the first time, being the golden child did not translate into rescue. I could hear it in her silence, the unfamiliar weight of consequences settling in. Weeks earlier, my parents had believed they could define me and then appeal to me when it suited them. They had mistaken my quiet for flexibility, my restraint for availability. Saying no did not feel satisfying. It felt necessary. There is a difference between helping someone who is facing harm and protecting someone from the discomfort of their own choices. This was the latter. By the end of the month, the calls stopped. The messages slowed. The urgency faded into something colder and more distant. Keller did not avoid me. When our paths crossed briefly at a family gathering later, he acknowledged me with the same respect he always had, no more and no less. He did not ask for favors. He did not offer apologies on anyone else's behalf. He understood the boundary because he lived by similar ones. As for my parents, the absence of my intervention forced them to sit with a reality they could not manage with tone or titles. The system they trusted had spoken clearly, and it was not interested in their comfort. That was the cost of the audacity they had shown in assuming my authority was available to them on demand. When you are asked to help, you have to decide what kind of help is being requested. Are you saving someone from real harm, or are you being asked to rescue an ego that refuses to bend? Morning returned the way it always did, quietly and without commentary. I woke before the alarm made coffee in the small kitchen and watched steam curl toward the ceiling while the local radio filled the room with traffic updates and weather I already expected. Outside, the light was pale and steady, the kind that makes everything look honest. I locked the door, walked to my car, and drove toward the bridge that cut across the water, the same route I had taken 100 times without thinking. The radio host joked about construction delays and spring pollen, and I found comfort in the predictability of it. Life had a way of continuing, even when narratives collapsed. At my desk later that morning, the routine settled in. Emails opened and closed, schedules aligned. Small confirmations arrived and were acknowledged with the same economy of words I had always used. Yes, understood, I will confirm. Nothing about the work felt heavier after the dinner. If anything, it felt cleaner. I realized then that I did not need my parents to understand what I did. Understanding was never the missing piece. Respect was. And respect does not come from explanation when someone has already decided what you are worth. It comes from boundaries that hold even when they are tested. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a quiet shift inside myself. I was less reactive to the idea of family approval, less tempted to replay conversations and imagine better responses. The absence of constant defense felt like relief. I had spent years believing that if I could just find the right words, my parents would see me differently. What I learned instead was simpler and harder. I did not need them to see me at all. I needed them to stop defining me. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no speeches, no apologies that arrived wrapped in clarity. There was just distance measured and calm, the kind that allows everyone to adjust without forcing growth. Tessa stopped calling for a while. Frank and Diane sent brief messages on holidays, polite and contained. Keller remained consistent in the few interactions we had, respectful without familiarity, a reminder that professionalism does not require intimacy. I returned to my routine fully, not as an escape, but as a choice. The work mattered, the quiet mattered, the lack of applause mattered most of all. One evening after work, I sat on the balcony with my coffee and watched the sun lower itself behind the buildings, the water catching the light and letting it go. I thought about the way my parents had clung to uniforms as proof of worth, how they had mistaken visibility for value. I thought about how easily they had used silence as a tool against me, and how easily I had mistaken endurance for peace. The truth settled gently without drama. I did not need them to understand my life. I only needed them to stop hurting me in the name of love. That realization did not feel like victory. It felt like adulthood arriving late but intact. Some families only respect uniforms. I learned to respect myself. Dignity does not beg. It stands. As the radio played softly behind me and the evening cooled, I wondered about the cost of silence and the price of speaking up. Do you think silence is strength? Or is it permission for someone to keep hurting you?